Hey guys, welcome to your lesson on how to solve quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. So far we've learned several ways to find the roots or the zeros of a quadratic equation. Now, if you remember, roots are zeros, right? So you have an xy axis, you have a graph, a parabola that crosses the x-axis, typically at 2 spots, but it could be 1 spot or 0 spots, and those would be your roots wherever it crosses the x-axis. So, we've learned how to graphically find our roots on the graphing calculator. We have learned how to factor and algebraically find our roots, but not all quadratic equations are factorable. So it works, but it's not going to work on every single problem. We recently learned how to complete the square. It's often the most difficult for students to remember, so it's pretty tedious in that sense unless you remember the steps. And we've also learned the square root method the most recently. Now, the square root method might be the easiest one, aside from typing it into your graphing calculator, but it only works if that middle term, that bx term, is not there. So we can't use that every time either. So the best option is going to be the quadratic formula. And that's what we're going to learn today. It works every single time on any equation, any quadratic equation, and all you have to know is this formula. Now, this formula will be given to you on the Regents, so you don't have to have it memorized, but you probably will naturally memorize it just because we're going to use it so much. So here's what it is. It's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And yes, I know that sounds really tedious and long, and you're thinking, I'll never remember that, but trust me, I guarantee that you will eventually. Okay, so the first example that we're going to do says solve in simplest radical form. And we just learned that recently as well, but we'll get to that at the end. So our equation is x squared minus 2x minus 2 equals 0. Now, it has to be set equal to 0 before we can do anything. Just like when we factored, that's what we had to do first. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by figuring out what is our A, what is our B, and what is our C. So, hopefully you remember that A is always the term in front of x squared. And if nothing is written in front of x squared, then our A is 1. Our B is always the number that is in front of our x. So in this scenario, our b is negative 2. And our c is always the number that is not attached to any variable, often written at the end, and so our c would be negative 2 as well. Okay, so all we have to do is substitute in to this formula. So we start with x equals, and there's a negative in our formula, right? But there's also a negative in our b. So if I write negative negative, that's going to simplify to a positive. So I'm going to start the equation with positive 2. Then I have plus or minus, which you might remember from when we took the square root of something, there was that plus or minus answer. Well, that still applies, and that's going to show up in every single one of our quadratic formulas because we're often going to get 2 answers. And that plus or minus will give us the 2 answers. Okay, then we have a big radical symbol. We want to make it big so that we can fit all of the numbers inside that we need to. And then inside, now this part is important. You always want to put the b value that you are squaring in parentheses. And it's because if you type it into your calculator without parentheses, and that number is negative, your calculator is going to give you the wrong result. So you might as well just get in the habit of always using parentheses to put around the number before you square it. Okay, so our b value is -2, and that -2 needs to be squared according to my formula. And then I have a minus. Now that's a subtraction symbol, it's not a negative symbol. So keep that in mind. And then we've got the number 4, and that 4 needs to multiply with our a value, which we wrote down as 1. And then it also has to multiply with our c value, which we wrote down was -2. Okay, so that's all in the radical. Then we're going to do one big fraction bar, because if you notice in the equation, we have the whole thing has to be over the denominator, which is 2 times our a value, which we said was 1. Okay, so that is the plugging in step. Now we're going to simplify what we have in the radical. Now, in my opinion, the easiest way to do this is to write everything that's outside of the radical down. So that means we have 2 plus or minus. We're going to put a radical sign there with nothing in it yet, and that is all divided by, the denominator will simplify, 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, now that radical is empty, so I need to figure out what is this whole thing inside the radical simplified to. So I can type it all into my calculator at once. -2 in parentheses squared, -4 times 1 times -2, and when I hit enter, I should get 12. So this is what I have next: 2 plus or minus the square root of 12 all over 2. Now, the next question you have to ask yourself, is 12 a perfect square? Now, the answer to that is, hopefully you know, is no. 12 is not a perfect square, but we can simplify 12, if we remember from our lesson on simplifying radicals. So if I list all of the factors of 12, right, so I've got 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Of those options, the only perfect square and the largest perfect square listed is 4. So remember, the square root of 4 will turn into 2, and then the radical 3 can't be simplified, so it's just written below. So this has to replace what I have written in the spot of radical 12. So I have to write smaller, but what I have is x equals 2 plus or minus, remember, radical 12 simplified to 2 radical 3 all over 2. Okay, we're almost done. Remember, they want us to solve in simplest radical form, so as simple as we can go. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out, can 2, the denominator, divide nicely into both terms? So we can divide 2 by 2, and we can divide 2 radical 3 by 2. And I'm going to have to erase what I have over here so I can write my final answer. Okay, so 2 divided by 2 is 1. So I've got x equals 1. Can't forget about the plus or minus. Now when you divide with radicals, radical stays as is, right? So the 2 and the 2 divide each other, and that gives us 1. And then we still have the radical 3. If you don't like writing the 1 in front of the radical, it's like the same as I wouldn't normally write a 1 in front of x. Then I can write my final answer as x equals 1 plus or minus radical 3. And that is my final answer in simplest radical form. Okay, if you did not get everything written down, or you need more time with this page to decipher it, you might want to pause the video now because I'm about to go to a new page to start example 2. Okay, example 2, x squared minus 4 equals 0. So we're going to start by writing what is our a value, and what is our b value, and what is our c value. A is the number that is in front of x squared, which again is 1. Now b is the number that is in front of x, but we don't have an x term, so our b would actually be 0. And our c is the number at the end that is not attached to any variable, so our c would be negative 4. Okay. Now, we're going to use the quadratic formula listed up here, and it's going to start with x equals, so we've got x equals, then we start with our negative b. Now, negative 0, not really a thing, so we can just start with regular 0 plus or minus the square root. Remember, we write the first square root rather big to fit everything in it. And we have b is 0, so 0 squared minus 4 times our a value is 1 times our c value is negative 4, all divided by 2 times our a value of 1. So that was our first step, substituting the numbers into the letters in the formula. Now the second step is always going to be the same. We're going to write everything except for what's in the radical. So we have 0 plus or minus a radical of something, all divided by, and again, 2 times 1 is 2. Then we are going to type what's inside the radical, which is also known as the discriminant. We're going to type that all into the calculator at once, starting with parentheses 0 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 4. And that should give me, if I type it in correctly, 16. Now, we then ask ourselves, is the number inside of the radical a perfect square? Well, the square root of 16 is a perfect square because that just gives me an answer of 4, or plus or minus 4 if you remember that. But the plus or minus is already there. So we've got x equals 0 plus or minus, remember the square root of 16 gives us 4, so the radical disappears completely, all divided by 2. Okay, now we're going to end up with 2 answers here. So if we simplify the numerator, we're either going to get a positive 4 divided by 2 or a negative 4 divided by 2. And when we clean that up and we do our division, 4 divided by 2 is going to give us a positive 2, and negative 4 divided by 2 is going to give us a negative 2. So our final answer, and you can either write it as 2 separate things like x equals 2 or x equals negative 2, or you can write your final answer as one thing as long as you have that plus or minus in front to show that your answers are 2 and negative 2. Again, pause the video if you need more time copying this down, and we're going to go to our final example, example 3. Okay, I'm going to start by writing the quadratic formula. So you should probably too, it's just the more you write it, the more likely you are to memorize it. So it starts off with x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Okay, now we're going to use that formula, but first we're going to have to figure out what's a, what's b, and what's c. So a is again 1, the number in front of x squared, b is 6, and c is negative 9. Okay. Now, we're going to start with x equals, the formula starts with a negative, and then we have our b value, which in this scenario is 6. Then we've got plus or minus the square root of, in parentheses, 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times our c value, negative 9. All divided by 2 times our a value, which is 1. After we plug things into the formula, we are then going to have everything written down except for the number inside of the radical. So that in the next step, I would type into my calculator, parentheses, 6 squared, minus 4 times 1 times negative 9, and I should get the number 72. Now, next step. You ask yourself, is the number inside the radical a perfect square? Well, the answer to that is no. 72 is not a perfect square. So, off to the side, we need to figure out what is the largest perfect square that goes into 72. So, we start listing them. 1 and 72. That's not going to work. Move on to 2. 2 and 36. Now, that could work. Okay, because between 2 and 36, 36 is a perfect square, and that's definitely going to be the largest perfect square that exists as a factor of 72. So, the square root of 36 becomes 6, and radical 2 can't be simplified, so it's written as radical 2. Now, this 6 radical 2, it's what's going to replace radical 72 in our problem. So, we have negative 6 plus or minus 6 radical 2, all divided by 2. Last step, we simplify this as much as possible. So we're going to divide negative 6 by 2 and 6 radical 2 by 2. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. Don't forget the plus or minus. Now, 6 radical 2 divided by 2. Only the numbers outside of the radical are allowed to divide with one another. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, and the radical 2 stays as is. So our final answer is x equals negative 3 plus or minus 3 radical 2. And that will conclude our notes for today.